Good evening. Thank you very much. And thank you, Alexander. And thank you, Lucy, also for helping to organize the talk. And thank you to the Council for supporting these things. Yeah, we're going to talk tonight about an interesting conjunction of things. It all started when when we went to Cavalry and Guards Club in November 2019. Alexander organized that wonderful centenary. And on the invitation was the great phrase, medals may be worn. So I was overjoyed because I've waited 60 years to have an opportunity to wear a medal. And then my joy turned to disaster because I suddenly realized I didn't have a medal. So the opportunity was there, but there was no medal to be worn. So I looked around and eventually I came across something that indeed is a medal, but it puzzled me greatly when I actually got hold of it to see what it actually meant. And it's from the discoveries from this particular medal that the idea of this talk came together. And you can see from the talk here that we're going to be talking about the emigration from Sweden in the 19th century mainly, but also in the 20th century, and how that led back in Sweden for the people who didn't leave to go to America to the stirrings of social democracy and the very big change in the country that then took place over quite a short space of time. Erik will deal with that. I'm doing what I call in my chapter 1, the Great Escape. So if we have a look at this medal, it's beautiful actually. I'm wearing it this evening, by the way. It's a beautiful medal. And when you start to look at it, you think, what's going on? There are 5.5 geese that are traveling from east to west. Very exciting, I thought to myself. I wonder what's that about? Obviously, it's a representative image. It's a conceptual display of what the pioneers would have been doing, leaving Sweden to go to America. But there are a few problems. No goose does that particular path. They would only, if they were migrating at all, go north to south. I mean, why would you leave one cold country to go to a colder country? Not very sensible. And also, the distance between Malmo and Chicago is 6,900 kilometers. It's a long effort, even for the strongest of geese. And then I even wondered what sort of goose it might be, and it's probably a grey lag goose, which would be the commonest in Sweden. There's also a beautiful picture of Gustav V there, as you can see. So I had to explain, when you looked around this medal, what are the pioneers, why are the geese there, and what are these two dates, 1848 to 1948? What's all that about? So I started to dig. And what did I find? Well, there's one possible explanation for the dates, and that is that in 1848 in Stockholm, there was an uprising as part of a very big movement across the whole of Europe, particularly in Austria-Hungary and in Holland and Belgium, as were. And this was a movement really of revolution, and many monarchies were rattled and deposed. But even in Sweden, there was a mass Orłowski, where 18 people were shot on the orders of Oscar I because of insurrection. But it didn't last very long. I didn't see why that would then lead to over 1 million Swedes leaving Sweden in the next 100 years or so. And then I thought, well, maybe there's another reason for the 1948. And it was King Gustav V's 90th birthday at that point. So maybe that was the answer. But the more you looked, the more confusing it was. There were maps and things and stamps put out by the Swedish Pioneer Centennial, all of which had this pair of dates, 1848 and 1948. But if you look at the Swedish American Historical Society, they say that the people started to leave Sweden for America in 1820. And indeed, as we'll show you, the dates really don't correspond with anything. So was this really quite a cunning attempt after the Second World War to ingratiate the Swedes with the Americans? The Americans were pretty cross with the Swedes because of what happened in the Second World War. And now we had a single superpower, effectively speaking, arguable, but effectively speaking. And wouldn't it be good to refound relations on a positive basis? Well, actually, the whole thing was very political. There was, of course, a big party, but there was politics behind that party as well. And President Truman was heavily briefed and gave a very, very long speech decrying the idea of neutrality and really extolling Sweden to take sides. And he didn't mean two sides, he only meant one side, take the side of the Americans. And the American government was certainly very concerned about neutrality and the effect that might have in Scandinavia, particularly in Finland, for example. So this had high politics mixed in with some opportunities for a party. Now, there really was a centennial celebration. So the medal was actually coined at that point and distributed. There were about 18,000 people there, and I believe that everybody who attended the event and the festivities got a medal similar to the one that I'm wearing. And at the occasion, President Truman was there from America, Prince Bertil, who was the third son of Gustav IV, Adolf, and everybody was speaking. And then on midsummer, as was or would be in America, there was a nice big party. So everybody had a jolly good time, and it was certainly a very big event. But I think behind it all, there were other forces at work, shall we say, to try to leverage the opportunity that they had to get hold of some senior Swedes who were in America. So what is this emigration? Was there actually an emigration really to give rise to this centennial, so-called? We can remember that there was an emigration from Sweden to America, but that was in the 17th century. A small number of explorers and traders were emigrating to look for new trade markets as part of Nya Sverige, as with every other empire going out there. And here's a beautiful couple of diagrams. This is the Delaware River. And what you can see there is a number of small settlements, Uppland and Christina and Fort Casimir. Only 600 people actually lived in this area. And the whole settlement didn't last very long, unfortunately, because what happened was, having been founded by the New Sweden Company, or the Swedish West India Company, very soon after that, the Dutch took over. And as soon as they'd taken over, the British took over. A certain William Penn and other people got interested in this area, and the rest, shall we say, is history. So this isn't the emigration really we're talking about. What I'm talking about is one that happened in the 19th century. At that time, Norway, Ireland, and Sweden had the most people emigrating from Europe to other parts of the world. And there indeed was a mass emigration from Scandinavia, beginning around 1820 to 1830, and it continued at varying rates up to just before the Second World War. During that period, that's about 120 years, 300,000 Danes and similar number of Finns, a few Icelanders, 800,000 Norwegians and 1.3 million Swedes emigrated from Europe, out of Sweden to Europe, North America, South America, Australia, and elsewhere. Now, very interestingly, and Erik will deal with this later, some of them came back in the early 20th century, and we'll see why they chose to leave and what the factors were that then brought them back a little later on. But really, by the mid-19th century, Sweden was in the throes of a population crisis. The population had doubled and was still growing, but the amount of land that was available for agricultural use had not increased at all. And for example, in the late 1860s, there was a famine, killing 80,000 people in Sweden. You remember, of course, in Ireland, there were famines. Well, there were famines in other parts of Europe. And industrialization in Sweden was really very slow compared to Germany, France, or the UK. Now, whenever there are emigrations, there are pushes and there are pulls. So we'll better have a look at a few of the factors that might have influenced people to stay or to leave. The push factors were very dominant here, pushing people away. Poverty, want, hunger, high infant mortality. Land stock was limited, the economy was weak, there was famine. There was a very strict social hierarchy, gentry versus the peasants. There was very little help for the poor. The Poor Act of 1871, the second of the Poor Acts, essentially said if you were able-bodied and able-minded, you had to fend for yourself. Nobody would help you. There was no political will to adapt or share resources more evenly. There were child auctions, and child auctions means that if you couldn't afford to keep your child, you would put the child up for auction, and the lowest, yes, sick as it were, the lowest bid would win the child. Those carried on until 1918 in Sweden and in the 1930s in Finland. There was no prospect really of escaping a terribly harsh life. And this explains why so many people left. Okay, why America? There were some pull factors drawing folk to a new place. There were tales of great prosperity. There was an opportunity for education and a better standard of living, and for people to better themselves and their families. The laws preventing emigration from Sweden were repealed around 1830. And there was a Homestead Act of 1862, which was put in place in America, right in the middle of the Civil War there, which allocated to each person who had never borne arms against an American person 160 acres of land, provided that they built a homestead on it of some sort. And that came free. And with the advent of steam-driven liners and the mass movement of people, ticket prices fell substantially. So if you put all these facts together, a very, very tough life in Sweden and the opportunity to have 160 acres of land, provided you put something back into the bargain, you can begin to see what people might have left. The Swedish population, left panel, had started to rise in the 19th century, where the arrow is, but it would have risen by at least 2 million more over that period had people not left Sweden. So it did make an impact, even though, unlike Ireland, you see, the emigration from Ireland was so extreme that the population of Ireland shrank in the 19th century. This wasn't the case in Sweden, but the increase was capped by the number of people leaving. But of course, because there wasn't enough agriculture or food to feed all these people. And if you look at the economy of Sweden, it was really only in 1920 that less than half of the total economic output of the country was from agriculture. Up to that point, agriculture dominated. We in the UK had reached the same point, 50%, in 1850, so that's 70 years earlier. So again, it was agricultural, industrialization was very, very slow. Service economy also very, very slow. So why the USA? Well, everybody was going there. 50 million Europeans left in 100 years. 1.3 million Swedes came to the US. They were usually healthy, young men living in groups or family units. They settled in Illinois or Minnesota, Iowa, Texas or Wisconsin. And starting in small numbers, only 118,000 in 1860. Once that Homestead Act was passed in 1861 and 62, by 1910, there were 665,000 Swedes in that part of the world. And the peak emigration was in 1887. And by 1920, there were 623 first generation and 824,000 second generation Swedes. And when in 2000, there was a US census and the Americans were asked about their ancestry, 4 million of them put Swedish down, a very, very important minority group in America, contributing a very great deal to American society. Why Minnesota? Well, most Swedes did go to Minnesota. You could say it was the right place at the right time. And in the end, 10% of the state was Swedish and up to 70% in some smaller areas. Why Minnesota? Why not some other areas, South Carolina or Georgia? Well, to start with, it was the land that was available and the opportunities the land gave people. But as Swedes became more prosperous there, they went into the cities. So by 1900, Chicago was the city with the second highest population of Swedes in the world. Stockholm had 300,000. Chicago had 160,000, and Göteborg had 130,000. So if you wanted the second city of Swedes, it was Chicago. It wasn't somewhere in Sweden. So a few people have also said that Minnesota's geography is rather like Sweden. I'm going to make that point too much, and you won't really believe it, but I'll show you a diagram in a minute. Maybe that was part of it. But I think really what it was people went there first. Once they'd settled there, they wrote great letters back saying, it's wonderful here, you must come, all of you. And a lot did. So migration chains were then made, which drew others across. And of course, initially to the rural areas and then to the cities. And this tradition, the Minnesota Swedish Americans, for example, continue to honor their ethnic roots. And if you go over there, you will see a lot of Swedish shops and Swedish goods and things. A little bit like you do in certain parts of London, of course, an expatriate community. If we look at this, we can see here where the arrow is, and this is a heat map, and you can see with the red is the density of people settling in Illinois and Minnesota. But you can see that people then went from there across to the west. So it was go west, young Swede, as it were, as you can see for the rest of the time. And relatively few people went south or even went backwards on north. Here I'm going to make a faintly ludicrous point, but the shape of the Great Lakes, which of course is on the right-hand side, you can see Great Lake Michigan there between Michigan and Wisconsin, is very, very similar to Vättern. And Vänern there above is very similar in shape to Lake Superior. Now, Who could appreciate that but a goose? Because a goose eye would spot this straight away and would land there thinking it had gone around the world just once too many times and come straight back to Sweden. Slightly fatuous, but actually not entirely. There were a lot of trees there, a lot of logging there. The temperature range that people were living there was very similar. It was actually, if not exactly a home from home, it wasn't so very dissimilar from some parts of Sweden. You can see here the temperature for Dalarna and St. Paul's, Minnesota, and really they have a very similar excursion. The caveat, this is today's temperatures. They would have been 2 or 3 degrees lower, I think, in the 19th century. But essentially, chilly cold winters requiring typical Swedish clothes for the winter and relatively warm summers, although the amount of sunlight might have varied. Now, I'm going to show you some pictures which really, I think, give you the flavor of what people's lives were actually like when they were there. This is Sweden. In about the 1870s, the Swedes decided to plant sugar beet to try and supplement their diet. It was only as late as that. It would only grow in Skåne and a few places slightly north of there. And this is a very typical picture. There are 17 or 18 women here, and there's one man telling them what to do. And this was essentially what happened in Sweden for most of the 19th century. Of course, it was a sad moment when people came to say goodbye to their mother, father, uncle, aunt, perhaps feeling they'd never see them again. And in many cases, unfortunately, that was the case. Although, as Erik will tell you, some did come back towards the end of their lives when they'd made a lot of money and were much more prosperous. And there were reasons perhaps to come back to Sweden at that point that weren't there when they left. They had a much better life to look forward to, so they left on big ships. Well, after 1860, when these big ships became regularly in use. And what they would do, if they were in the south of the country, near Malmo, for example, they might go on the train down to Hamburg and get the big ocean liners across from there to North America. The other option would be to leave from Gothenburg, from Göteborg, and then take the very well-known ferry to Hull. There are few reasons to go to Hull. I haven't found one yet. But anyway, people did go to Hull, and then they would take the train across from Hull to Liverpool, and from there they go across the Atlantic. Very brave. It cost a bit of money, but of course it was their passage to a new life. When they got there, many of the people who probably never seen strangers like this before were possibly quite taken aback in the emigration centers. But essentially this made the point that they were out of their comfort zone. They had to make something of this opportunity, and that's exactly what they did. Here's a family that came from Närkeshild, just north of Örebro, I think, and they come in 1880, and by 1887, they got their own homestead, they got their land, and they were wealthy and prosperous, and certainly turned out very nicely for the photograph. And also in, of course, America, you didn't have 18 or 19 women tending the field, you had machines. So you could actually do farming at a pace. So here's a steam-driven threshing machine that made everything much easier to do and much more efficient. Logging was still possible and was done in much the same way. So if people wanted to have a less skilled job, or they had learnt logging while they were in perhaps the more northern parts of Sweden, they could do exactly the same thing over there. And Swedes worked hard and made rapid social, economic, and educational progress, and became gentry. In Chicago, one Swede by about 1900 was a deputy mayor. The panel on the right-hand side there is President Truman being talked to by Prince Bertil. So this was a success story. Actually, if you read the Swedish novelist and feminist Fredrika Bremer, she points out that actually it was really hard to be over there. If we look at the bottom panel there, rather than the top bit, one farmer told her that none who are not accustomed to hard agricultural labor ought to become farmers in this country. No one who is in any other way well off in his native land ought to come hither. It was tough, but the opportunities were there, and it was fair, so they could get their fair share. They put the effort in, they got reward. There was a lot of disquiet in Sweden. I'll deal with that a little later in my small section. Here's an example, of course. This is what Per Svensson was promised, his idyll in Sweden. There he is sitting on the left-hand side in palm trees. By the way, there aren't many palm trees in Minnesota, but this is sort of giving the impression he's down in Florida. And his children are basically catching fish, and they're jumping out of the water into the net for them. Isn't that wonderful? I'd like to go. But actually, what was the purpose of this bit of advertising, which was widely distributed in Sweden, was to show the real thing that Per Svensson was facing. He was facing attack by savage natives, his animals running away, the soil was unbreakable, the time was truly tragic. And this was to try to put people off from leaving Sweden. And it didn't really work, though, fortunately. There's a tremendous history of this emigration. It's extraordinary, actually, when you dig into it. Most of it, I have to say, in America, more of it there than there is in Sweden. But there are books, book upon book, there are symposia, there are accounts that are available online. It's an extraordinary richness of source material if people want to study this. And it's a source of great pride, I think, to the Swedes of the Americans of Swedish descent. Of course, there are the books by Wilhelm Mulberg, a very interesting character. He wrote 4 of these books, 4 volumes between 1949 and 1959, and this tells the whole story, tragic and uplifting as it absolutely was. So what about Sweden? All of these people leaving has to have had an effect on Sweden, and this huge hemorrhage of healthy younger people emigrating left a group of people behind who were either less inclined to work or less able to work. So who was going to tend the fields? Who was going to look after the wealthy people who needed to have servants? Who was going to serve in the army? All of these questions began to really worry, particularly the conservative factions in Sweden. And there was many an accusation of lack of moral fiber or some form of sedition taking place, and many a prediction of collapse of the state. Because after all, by the beginning of the 20th century, 20% of all Swedes weren't in Sweden, they were in the US. So there was a commission set up in 1907, which took 6 years to report, by Gustav Sundberg. And really, in a way, it was a little bit like our Beveridge report in the Second World War of 1943-44. And his job was to work out why people were leaving and what it would take to stop them leaving. And there were 2 schools of thought at that stage. The first was to bring the best of the US back to Sweden. In other words, why were people being pulled away from Sweden? Universal suffrage, education, proper housing, lack of poverty, or opportunities. Those were the reasons. But other points of view were, well, people are just showing a lack of resolve. And what we need to do is keep them here. So we'll bring back the laws that prevented people from emigrating, and we'll introduce universal male subscription, as it were, to the army, so we can get a good army and teach people how to live. And it was really the outcome of this particular commission that determined the way things went from there. Everybody agreed something must be done, but they didn't all agree what that was. To tell us what that was and what that meant, I'm now going to hand over to Erik. So I'll stop sharing and give the stage to him.
Thank you very much, David. So as David pointed out, we will now look back across the Atlantic at effectively the country, the nation, and the home left behind. It was very much a nation left in crisis, and to some extent even left in ruins. As dramatic as all of this sounds, I think David has really hammered home the point that it wasn't really a matter of drama at this stage. It was very much the reality of things. The high rates of migration and the social impact that all of this had back in Sweden could have truly left the country in destitution that would have taken generations to recover from, if indeed it would have recovered truly at all. So just to recap very, very quickly, a vast number of Swedes left, we know that much. The population reduction alone led to effectively a national crisis, an economic crisis, even a moral crisis. But this blade also cut both ways. People left due to famines, of course, an oppressive political and social system. They were leading lives that were largely hopeless, but eventually, as also David had pointed out, 25% roughly of people returned, which is, given the scope and scale of this whole situation, quite a remarkable number, really, of people willing to return. So why did people leave? These are important questions, of course. What were they experiencing? What drove them to leave at all? What were their new lives? What was the difference between their old home and their new home? But just much like David's medal, it also has a reverse, and these questions also come with their inverse. What happened to those who stayed? What did they do? What did they experience after all of these people left? And perhaps more interestingly at this stage is also to truly try to consider why did so many people end up returning. And quite understandably, the response in Sweden to this crisis, or the kind of broadly speaking hopeless existence that inspired people to leave in the first place, was a sense of anger or perhaps even rage. But the most important aspects of these emotions, whatever they might have exactly been, were that they ended up being organized in one way or the other. They were harnessed and subsequently targeted at something, at slights, whether real or imagined, or oppression, whether material or immaterial. Through this organization, then, hope finally started emerging, at least for some, for this was, of course, by no means a smooth path to proverbially travel. However, the future would be different, at least for better or worse, or so people thought. And as we know, momentum has a tendency of creating more momentum. All you need in this situation is to sprinkle in a little bit of political theory into the mix, and you can begin to trace the very early shape, and I'd like to remind you at this stage, still very emergent shape of Swedish social democracy. Sweden had, even by the standards of the time, and frankly outrageously socially strict social hierarchy. It's a type of strictness that really would put Prussia to shame at this stage. I mean, or at the very least, it would truly make Sweden live up to the adage of being the Prussia in the north. Social mobility was in effect impossible, let alone any established connection across any sort of class or group boundaries. The kings still ruled by divine mandate and could effectively not be questioned. The nobility were nobles simply because they were better than other people, and lesser men could not be given any responsibility, of course. Add to this the late, but once it started, relatively rapid rates of industrialization, and it started sending shockwaves through society at large. Population started urbanizing, people started shifting the ways they lived. The impacts on communities and social structure were difficult to in any way quantify or even qualify. And this is just to name a few. Just like no other country had escaped the enormous social upheavals that industrialization brought, Sweden society too would face that very bumpy road ahead. Economic modernity always went hand in hand with some form of social modernity. The same reasons why such remarkable amount of the population decided to leave also produced the very fertile grounds for early social democratic ideas to truly take hold, especially across the people that did sort of till the lands, the people that worked in the early factories and so on, which were at this stage very much the majority. As you saw in David's graph earlier, the other sort of service sector developed very slowly, and at this stage, we're talking the late 1800s, it was effectively non-existent. But it's worth noting at the same time that social democracy was very much a product of grassroots organizing. It wasn't particularly centralized, especially not in the beginning. It was a mixture, a wanton mixture really, of labor movements, of teetotal associations, even quite a large minority of Great Awakening Christianity or Christians. And these may appear as extremely bizarre bedfellows really in hindsight, but looking into this is sort of outside of the scope, but it is a fascinating thing. And if I do implore you to look more into it, if you do find it interesting, but the apparent disparate grassroots movements that fed into the early salient social democracy is very much and very clearly reflected in the philosophies and political theories that it took inspiration from. Of course, you have the very obvious for us today, the seminal works of, say, Marx and Engels, Communist Manifesto or Das Kapital, works like that. And this was undoubtedly had a huge impact in this movement. But that wasn't the whole story, though. There was also an enormous impact from in particular liberal philosophers, so the works of Locke or John Stuart Mill. And this is not even to touch on the sort of more kind of at that point newfangled interpretations of Protestant scripture and how that fed into ideas of social justice. It is with the help of and the cooperation between these grassroots movements that the Social Democratic Workers' Party, which from here on out I'm just going to refer to as the SAP because it's less a mouthful, was established in 1889 by tailor cum politician August Palm, who was an altogether fascinating individual who encountered his ideas working in Germany. But Palm was a real firebrand, and I read a short biography about him where he was simply referred to as a madman on several occasions. So this gives you some idea of the sort of individual this was. But firebrand he was, and he refused to shut up about the need for change, and rapid change at that. So in 1889 in Malmö, he held a speech titled "What Do the Social Democrats Want?" And this effectively led to the creation of the party itself, which that same year, which was also incidentally Sweden's first formally organized political party, which also gives you an idea of how far behind the curve Sweden's politics were, where it takes up until 1889 to form established formal political parties. But turning away from this for a moment, we must turn now to a man, and I think it's fair to say a mustache, which is not that man, but it is a great mustache. Instead, we have to turn to this man, which arguably also a very good mustache. There's going to be a lot of mustache in this presentation. We turn here to Hjalmar Branting, and I don't want to dwell too much on Branting the man, but I think it's important to get a good overview of his background and who he generally was. Hövdingen, or the chieftain, as he was known within the party, he was born into very much a bourgeoisie family, to use his own vernacular, in Stockholm. His parents were rather well-to-do. In fact, his mother was a noblewoman. Due to his background, he was very well educated, in particular for the time. He first attended the Beskovska school at the same time as King Gustav V, or then Prince Gustav, before turning to study natural philosophy at Uppsala. He was on track to become an astronomer more than anything. And when he instead, like one of these things happened, planets aligned, if you will, got an interest in current affairs. And instead he turned and became a journalist. And he first worked at a very left-wing newspaper called Flamman, and later one called Social Democracy, that was actually founded by August Palm in 1890. Branting also eventually, I believe, became editor of that particular newspaper in time. And a funny story about his journalistic career, he was eventually thrown in prison for 3 months because of it. By modern standards, this is an almost quaint story. He was actually down in Paris attending some sort of conference of some sort, a socialist conference, I believe, in 1880. I think it was in 1889, where he worked at, must have been when he worked at Flamman in that case. Anyway, he had in one of his articles denied the existence of God and was sentenced to 3 months in prison for being a heathen, in effect. So he cut his visit to Paris short, traveled back up to Sweden, to Stockholm, to serve his prison sentence, which is such a beautiful gentleman's agreement to how the law seems to have functioned. But moving on, Branting was prime minister on three different occasions. First, very short, March 1920 to October 1920. And then his major time in the office was between 21 and 23, during which he was also the foreign minister. This is something I will touch upon more later. And then in 1924 to shortly before his death in February 1925, he was also the Minister of Finance, 1917 to 1918. To further his political credentials, he was the first self-identified socialist member of parliament of Sweden from 1896, and for 6 years he was the only one. So he was very much a pioneer, if you will, within this particular branch of politics in Sweden. And he was also eventually, I think, he's largely been credited to be the first democratically elected socialist in Europe, maybe the world, but I'm not so sure about the latter. His extensive traveling, due in part to his work as a journalist and also his upbringing, made him a deeply worldly man. He was very, very well-versed and well-read. It was through his travels that he, of course, eventually came across the works of Marx and other Marxist authors or writers and similar thinkers. Nonetheless, as we shall soon see, he was not really a dogmatic Marxist, and in fact, he was kind of not a very good one, really. But he was very much a strong reformist more than anything else. He stood more strongly actually by traditionally liberal means, such as democracy, pacifism, and the very early ideas of human rights. Um, despite this, he was also very well respected within general socialist circles. And even though the branch of social democracy was only kind of really established later on, which I will also cover, Bunting called himself a social democrat as early as 1878. Now, as you can gather from this quick CV of the man, he did a lot, and there's a lot to cover. So rather than going through it chronologically, I've divided it into 3 vignettes, in effect, that together I hope will paint a very clear picture of Banting's role in modern Swedish history, and but also how it's shaped the politics of his day, but also the politics really of today. The vignettes will cover in particular his shift in focus from revolution to evolutionary politics, followed by his work on introducing universal suffrage in Sweden, and finally Banting's international engagement. I've put these in rough chronological order, but they're not fully chronological, so don't let that drive you too mad. We turn here to the first vignettes in that case. The quote on the page is from a guy called Seth Höglund, which later formed the Swedish Communist Party, and it alludes to Edward Bernstein, who's often credited with reforming Marxism along the lines of what we today call social democracy. Bernstein's reformed socialism only really reached mainstream political circles in 1896, and as you saw earlier, Banting called himself a social democrat already back in 1878. So he was very much ahead of his time with the idea of reforming and moving things away from the sort of what we can call the revolutionary ideal. As I also mentioned earlier, Banting was a kind of terrible Marxist by most means, insofar that he was truly a Republican first and foremost. He believed very strongly in the institutions of democracy above everything and anything else. And this, as a result, led him to naturally reject the idea of revolution from very early on. It was simply, to him, unacceptable. Though systemic change, the type that Banting himself espoused, might take longer, it would be more stable, and more importantly, in his world, it was also simply morally superior because it refused to submit to violence. This stance was only really solidified with the violent excesses of the Bolshevik revolutions in Russia, especially the latter one in 1918 and the subsequent civil war, because really his ideas then, or his stance then, went from being something purely theoretical to truly have something to show for itself. And it was with him being the very strong-willed leader of the Social Democratic Party that he brought the stance with him into his political life, even as a member of parliament, eventually the leader of the party, and eventually prime minister, that evolution was the way forward and revolution needed to just not be considered an option. However, due to the grassroots nature of the, broadly speaking, left movement in Sweden at the time, splintering was anything but uncommon. While many were adherents to the same sort of Marxist framework that was very common at the time, especially among these movements and parties, there were also, as I said, certain religious minorities or people that were very, what we today call traditionally liberal. This is not to mention the groups of other anarchists and later communists, syndicalists, and so on, that were other splinter groups of what we broadly speaking called left-wing philosophies. This had truly plagued the party from the very beginning, from its very foundations in 1889. And Banting's always had to effectively live through, had to shape all of his politics by trying to get enough of these splinter groups to pull in the correct direction at any given time. Because the party, the SAP was the outward-facing umbrella organization for all of these groups, for these unions, these local organizations, lobby groups, informal reading groups, university groups, youth groups, you get the picture. And it was effectively the SAP's job to represent them, particular within, within parliament or other more formal political circles. To give an example, to paint a picture of this, already back in 1908, leftist terrorists set up a bomb in Malmö Harbor targeting strikebreakers. A story that I could have a presentation on by its own. It's called the Amalfia Situation, and it's fascinating. It's more or less, it's arguably Sweden's first terrorist attack. And we can cover this further in the questions if people are interested. But already that was a small group effectively setting up its own little terrorist cell to carry out this attack. Or later on in 1917, when about a third of the SAP left to form the Communist Party, or what is today called the Left Party, Vänsterpartiet. And the same year, they also pulled the Social Democratic Youth Wing with them that had to be re-established under, I think, Per Albin Hansson that same year. So there's this constant push and pull and in all sorts of different directions. And this is not even touching upon the general ongoing removals of various splinter groups who are considered too extreme, but later fall back into favor to fall out of favor. It was the stability within the party was always threatened its political ability to carry out any sort of representation of any kind, because as this next slide said, being the leader of the SAP was in effect like herding cats. Banting, however, remained both absolute and resolute in his conviction that evolutionary change was the only morally acceptable choice into building a more just society. The Bolshevik Revolution invariably brought these internal fault lines to the fore. It is indeed no coincidence, of course, that the Communist Party and the Youth Wing were expelled, formed, and reformed in 1917, of course, because that, you know, these fault lines suddenly became particularly noticeable, to say the least. Meanwhile, though, it is also important to note that the SEP had not really gained any true political clout in the way that we perhaps are used to seeing them, in particular throughout the 60s and 70s. So they were very much still fighting against a generally broadly defined conservative bloc in parliament, and not to mention the king, Gustav V, who even at several situations simply threatened to refuse to assent for any government that included Social Democrats in critical positions. The king's unsurprising opposition to the party was in particular problematic because government ruled by mandate of the crown, not by mandate of parliament. However, faced with this truly Herculean task, Branting's at times iron-fisted control of the party pushed his own personal agenda really to the fore, insisting on this evolutionary approach above all else. It was what we now effectively kind of link very strongly with the sort of ideas of social democracy in Sweden in particular. His successful insistence served to save the party's political credentials in particular, because it alienated the smaller, more extreme groups that would have alienated, say, more liberally minded people. But it also allowed him to cross party lines, to cooperate with other parties and other groups, and kind of have a bit of a fluidity with who worked together and who didn't. And this ties in very clearly and very importantly into our second vignette, which is perhaps what Banting is most famous for, his association with bringing to pass universal and equal suffrage in Sweden, which was introduced as late as 1921. When the SAP was founded in 1889, only 5% of the Swedish population could vote. To give you some reference for this, in Britain, it was roughly 17 to 20%, and it would jump massively later in 1918 with the Representation of the People Act. France had already established universal male suffrage in 1851 for any man above the age of 21. In fact, looser requirements that Sweden would only enact in 1909 had already been enacted in Germany in 1869. Sweden was far, far behind many of the other countries in Europe when it came to the suffrage question in particular. These looser voting requirements introduced a form of limited male suffrage in 1909, but only for the lower chamber. You have to bear in mind that Sweden had a bicameral system at the time. The upper chamber was still income, gender, age, and so on restricted. Here are the general caveats for anyone that might be interested. For the lower chamber, one had to be 21 years old, be male, have paid state and communal tax for at least 3 years, have no debts, have not been declared bankrupt, and having completed the military service. For the upper chamber, on the other hand, you had to be 35 years old, be male, have an income of 3,000 Swedish crowns annually, which is today roughly 150,000 crowns, and own assets taxable above 50,000 Swedish crowns per year, which is today roughly 2.5 million. So the upper chamber was still very, very removed from even those that could vote for the lower chamber. Of equal importance in this setting, however, is how the government received its mandate, as mentioned earlier, by the king rather than by parliament. This severely restricted the capability of any real reformist party, whether the SDP or the Liberals or anybody else, to try and enact any meaningful change. They didn't only have to win mandates in either chamber, but also very specifically, they had to win royal favor in order to form government to begin with. I want to show now a quick timeline on screen. I'm not going to go through all of this in detail, but it shows how how the emergence of suffrage in Sweden happened quite quickly once it started gaining momentum. From 1896, when there was the first proposition, and then it was finally introduced in 1921. But it was 1917 is a key year in this, because the Liberal leader Nils Edén was invited to form government with Branting as finance minister. The king would not approve Branting for any other position, and the Liberals needed the SAP's support in order to have enough seats in parliament to enact any change at all. Branting despised having this position because it was extremely unpopular in a country that was so conservatively minded and had such a hard time in terms of, say, as David mentioned earlier, helping with poor relief and so on. It was probably the most hated political position. And so there was this attempt to try and outmaneuver to make him unpopular at the time. But this uneasy alliance between the Liberals and the SDP was brought together by a very clear shared goal: universal and equal suffrage. Early on in this cooperation, they put a bill to the floor already, in fact, in 1917, but it was promptly shot down. And they were aware that they were facing a number of challenges to get this bill passed at all. But time was tight. The various labor movements, unions, and other factions were tired of waiting for what they considered to be a right to be represented. And equally, the conservative bloc was unwilling to concede in that particular environment. Riots and strike became more common. Tension rose. Soldiers at Kalmar and Karlskrona were disarmed for fear of uprisings, similar to those in Kronstadt and Kiel in 17 and 18, respectively. A gunboat was even moored in Stockholm harbor, ready to open fire on any sort of mob that would, descend on any key position in the city, be that the palace, the parliament, or anywhere else. Sweden was really an oil fire at this time. And the big question is, how do you put out an oil fire? Turns out you set up an even larger fire next to it. It sucks out all the oxygen. And this is what happened in 1917. The Russian Revolution, the toppling of the Tsar, the destruction of the old system, the bloody excesses of the revolutionaries, the civil war that would come soon thereafter. This development changed everything in Sweden. Here you can see, by the way, Nils Edén in yellow and Branting, a very tall man, in red. As the years then turned from 1917 to 1918, the news from Russia and the subsequent instability of revolutionary violence, in particular Germany, terrified the kings and the upper echelons in Sweden. What would happen if revolution spread, especially what would happen if it spread here? The shock and awe of the Russian Revolution it is very clearly shown in Gustav V's reaction to all of this. His wife, Victoria of Baden, the Swedish queen, was in Germany at the time, and she lost contact because she had to flee her home. And nobody at the court knew what might have befallen her. There were riots all over the place. She might have gotten hurt. She might have been taken prisoner. She might have even gotten killed. During this same time, the Prince Erik, died of the Spanish flu in Stockholm. The king was broken. In fact, there's a story of a meeting with his council the king had, where he was completely apathetic. He was simply looking at a document with his hand shaking, not engaging with anything. He had a hard time knowing what to do. He wasn't sleeping. As the story goes, at the end of the meeting that was cut short, both Blanting and Adéan walked up to His Majesty and said something along the lines of, "Don't worry, Your Majesty, we will ensure to look after you." What I'm trying to paint here is that, in short, the conservative bloc, king and all, were ready to compromise, not only with the environment in Sweden, but with everything that was happening around. But here's the irony: the liberals and the Social Democrats were not. In fact, they had one major point of contention. The SVP's party program demanded republicanism. The liberals did not. Though the respective leaders, Adéan and Blanting, were more than happy to compromise on what they saw as a generally minor point in exchange for having universal suffrage, the issue was more with the various representatives in the various chambers of people who would simply vote against because they were very much kind of following the party programs, or perhaps losing support of some unions somewhere, or whatever it might be. A negotiations were tense, but an agreement was eventually reached between the two leaders, and Blanting had to spin this particularly carefully in what is probably the most important speech of his career, where he had to show up to an emergency party conference in the middle of the night in a gymnasium filled with a few thousand people to effectively tell them that they would get, at this early stage, universal male suffrage, but that the king would remain on the throne. And he spun this in a very realpolitik way by effectively saying, the king knows his days are numbered, so now he's more of an asset than anything else, and we are better off using him as a political pawn. Finishing the speech, there was a moment of silence before the hall broke out in thunderous applause. The party was with him, and a bill was passed that same year that introduced, as I said, universal male suffrage. Women would still only be able to vote in the local elections, and that was a universal suffrage would only be introduced in 1921. But it was still a huge victory for this social democratic liberal coalition. It was probably the largest systemic change that took place during the sort of first 30 years of the 20th century. Incidentally, very soon thereafter, the social democratic liberal coalition fell apart quite spectacularly, but that's, again, another story. I want to turn now to the third vignette, which in 1921, Blanting shared the Nobel Peace Prize together with Norwegian Christian Lange, specifically for their enormous contributions to the not only establishment, but for the furthering of the League of Nations. As you can see, the quote simply says, for their lifelong contributions. However, the Nobel Peace Prize in this case was very much just a culmination of many, many years' involvement on the international stage, even before his entry as a politician in capacity as like prime foreign minister. Blanting was truly an internationalist. He called himself a constitutional pacifist, to be precise. That is, that security should be based on the functional principles of justice, that truth and dispute should be tested through arbitration by a judicial body, not through some sort of survival by combat that he thought war always was. Values that he had really held since before the Great War, but like his stance on evolutionary politics, was only really proven in the most spectacular and tragic fashion with the outbreak of the Great War itself. International cooperation in his mind truly was everything, and it would be the only way to find any lasting stability and peace in the future. As a young man, he had traveled across Europe and attended several congresses of, in particular, the Second International of Socialists, sharing ideas and thoughts with other thinkers of the day, though, as we all know, he missed that one in Paris for his kind of ridiculous prison sentence. In 1920, he worked actively and tirelessly to bring Sweden into the League, fighting both his own party and the conservative opposition, saying on record several times that the only way to counter any form of authoritarianism, being it the Bolsheviks or the emerging fascists in Italy, was through the full, unwavering force of democratic process. Nothing more, nothing less. His stance, however, was very much put to the brink with the Ålands question that was only settled in 1922. As we all know, Åland was disputed territory between Finland and Sweden at the time. And the League of Nations ruled in favor for Finland, knowing, of course, that 90% of the island's population wanted to remain Swedish. Bunting's response to this, as was a comment where he, I think, said in a speech that as a prime minister, he could not accept the outcome, but as an individual man, he would simply have to. As such, Sweden pursued no further action to gain the islands back, militarily or otherwise. Further on in the 1921 election, or at the same time in the 1921 election, Bunting had hoped to avoid the role as prime minister, especially as he had been barely been present in the run-up to the election, because of his involvement with the League of Nations in Geneva. However, Realpolitik once again sort of won the day, as he felt acceding to the sitting von Sydow government would entirely defeat the point of parliamentarianism. If he had been voted with the majority, he sort of had to come back to fill the role. He did attempt to create another coalition with the Liberals, but that also failed, and he thus took on both the role as PM and foreign minister, giving him the name of the double excellence.
20 hours.
But he was often criticized at the time for spending more time in Geneva than Stockholm. As a small note, he was, by the way, also one of the first politicians of note to openly refer to the Armenian genocide as a genocide already back in 1917. In conclusion here, his involvement in the international community really cannot be understated. Karl Kautsky wrote after Bunting's death that he was the first leader to try to create a so-called Schutzwehr der Unterdrückten, which effectively means a sort of protective force for the smaller nations of the world, and really the first one to want to use the League of Nations to protect smaller countries' rights to exist. To sum up here, I'm going to quote from a paper from a short article written at the time of Bunting's life, where somebody wrote that it was not until Hjalmar Bunting came on the scene that the play began in earnest. The scene, of course, in this context being the political scene. He died in 1925 after another short stint as prime minister from ill health. He was both a heavy smoker and very likely by our standards a heavy drinker. His 3 premierships had been quite short. They had largely failed to live up to any real potential. He was being forced to resign very often before completing a full mandate period. Often having to fight his own party, failing to bring to pass many of the proposed changes, having to find middle ground of the party program and many of the party stances. On the other hand, though, he established the Social Democratic Party in Sweden as one capable of governing, a feat at which the SAP could not have experienced its uniquely long time in power, especially after 1932. And he did so through effectively democratic means. But there's also more to Bunting's success than these. He laid the foundations for a number of re-emerging themes in Swedish political history, ones that I'd hoped to really paint with the above vignettes. Firstly, the shift from revolutionary socialism to evolutionary socialism laid a foundation for a party doctrine and ideology that was particularly non-dogmatic in its ideological roots, changes that we can then trace and find later in Swedish political history. However, it perhaps more importantly creates a parliamentary environment that favored coalition cooperation, allowing larger parties to the ideological flexibility and expectation to work with smaller parties. These are things we still see today. Secondly, through his and at times his iron-fisted control of the party, he established a very important focus on social justice, really focusing on the highlights to really engage with the democratic process as the core of political life and the body politic. Of course, these ideals are not unique to the SCPs or any sort of leftist or socialist party as such, but I mean, we can just look at other countries to see that, these weren't developed uniquely because of that, and also not to mention how the SCP often failed to live up to many of its own ideals. But in this position, in this stage in Swedish political history, it was really the SCP in its first attempt to sort of try to push it to the fore, of course, working together with the Liberals. That could again only happen because of the previous point. Finally, his work on the international stage centered on Sweden's non-interventionist stance, which we're all very well aware of as Swedish neutrality now, And it really sowed the seeds for Sweden's later ascent as an actor on the global stage, an actor that punches well above its own weight, particularly through his focus on diplomacy and cooperation rather than any sort of military force projection. As such, Branting's leadership, Branting was a landscape architect, in effect. He laid out a garden, he sowed the seeds, he prepared paths, but he never really was the one who got to tend any of it. That was a responsibility that fell to those who succeeded him, perhaps more prominently names like Per Albin Hansson or Tage Erlander. But Branting himself was perhaps not as prolific in modern day Sweden. We don't remember him as such, perhaps. Likely because he came from a very different world, from the sort of world that David outlined, a Sweden that I think none of us would really recognize today. But similarly, I also think it's because the important part to remember about Branting's policies, for lack of better words, is that they have become so social-culturally ingrained that we're now sort of take them a bit for granted. They're all around us. We don't really see them as such because we merely understand them as universal truths. I want to have a little epilogue on this before having summed up Branting, but really tie it back to the beginning. Because we ended up here with a Sweden that faced enormous crisis throughout the 19th century, with 1/3 of the population left and had this hopeless existence in Sweden. And they all left for this land of milk and honey, a land of hopes and dreams. It is, of course, clear that something had to change. The historical record makes that extremely clear. Sweden, throughout that century, was dysfunctional, to say the least, and some sort of change came, for better or worse. I'd wager, given the context, that it was change for the better. But at the same time, we shouldn't be too harsh on Sweden either. After all, no country managed to industrialize without facing some form of growing pains. In Britain, we have examples such as Peterloo, a talk that Dave and I have had in the past, or the enormous political instability in France, causing them to restart their republics, that's N+1 every few years. Or perhaps the tragic fate of Germany and its eventual explosion into the seminal tragedy of the past century. The point is here not that no country escaped the problems associated with restructuring a society along the lines of industry and modernity. There is nothing inherent in this case in the Social Democrats as either party or ideology that made them uniquely equipped to guide Sweden through a particular tumultuous time. Indeed, it's not as if they did, really. Just look at how suffrage was very much a joint success between the liberals and the Social Democrats. The emergence of a particularly strong social democratic political tradition is the result of a very specific political and cultural context that created this very particular Swedish context. The interesting aspect of this to consider is, of course, is not only what the party or its adherents managed to achieve, or indeed what they failed in achieving, but also what caused this particularly strong tradition to emerge in the first place, and what has its impact been on Sweden in the present, in our social relations, the truths that we take for granted, our cultural behaviors, or indeed political values. I described Branting as a landscape architect earlier, the man who set a proverbial board, but not the one who got to play it. What Branting's career and impact show us more than anything is that nothing is really set in stone, and even the most monolithic institutions will bend or even break under pressure. What then will Branting's successors do with the pieces that he sets them? How will his ideas and ideals change over time, and what will their strong impacts be on Swedish society, culture, and political values? After all, for better or worse, social, cultural, and political forces have always been in flux. They have, to some extent, always been fluid. Thank you. That is the end of my bit. And I suppose we will now turn to some I'll hand back to Alexander, then I suppose we'll turn to some questions.
Well, I'm going to say thank you, of course, to our star duo, David and Erik, who have not only done more talks than anyone else, but also are the godfathers of this format, which really has grown and grown, so that we're just routinely having 70 and 80 now. We're going to have to upgrade our Zoom account, which is super. Christina, huge turnout as well last time. So thank you so much. and also every month now for 9 months, and more planned for the coming months as well, and eventually we will see each other again in person. Valborg, Cirka will be happy to hear this. Hello, Cirka's grandchildren there. Christina's looking very peaceful upstairs. It has been booked for the 22nd of April 2022, but of course we're hoping to see each other before that. I just taking the chance now just also to say thank you to the sister societies, Swedish British Society, York Anglo-Scandinavian, COSCAN, our umbrella organization, Confederation of Scandinavian Societies, Anglo-Swedish Society of Gothenburg, and also the Swedish English Literary Translators Association, and all the other associations that I've forgotten to mention now. Also for joining in, and this is a wonderful thing that we can do together. And I'm going to also chair the because I've got this enormous screen, I'm going to ask people just to wave frantically if they want to ask a question, and I'll hand back to Erik and David as appropriate. Who wants to kick off? Who's the brave one? In the meantime, I can also say I spot Maria Romano on screen, who's our most recent friend of the arts. So thank you very much. Yes, I've got Julian Baldwin.
Yes, good evening. I'm very interested to hear a little more, perhaps from David, about the returning Swedes who went back to Sweden after having emigrated to the US, and what caused them to go back, and what news and progress did they bring with them to revolutionize Swedish culture and industry?
I think it's an excellent question. I hope yes, I'm not on mute. It's a great question. I think essentially the sort of people who went back were those who'd done very well. They'd reached the end of their conventional careers, and they really had a yearning for the mother country. They never entirely lost their enthusiasm for Sweden. And once the scars of their difficult existence had begun to heal, they went back and hoped that things would be better. And a lot of them actually were pleasantly surprised when they did go back in, let's say, 1910 or 1920, by how much Sweden had changed. Because, of course, if they'd left 30 or 40 years before, the country was far from where it should have been, but was clearly on a journey towards where it wanted to be. So I think they were a force to be reckoned with in coming back. But those who came back were ones who succeeded. It's not really those who didn't do so well. Most Swedish immigrants did do well, actually, in various ways. That's why, in the end, so many stayed, and there's so much of a pride in that community in America still. But I think the few that did come back were forces to encourage the country on its journey towards a modern way of living. And perhaps we're able to tell them stories of what it's like when people can go to work and receive a fair wage, their children can have proper clothes and proper food, and they can make their own way in the world without depending on others.
Julian's nodding as if you've answered his
question.
Yes,
I think you've addressed the point. I mean, if you wanted to progress it a little bit, I wondered what sort of industries did Swedes going to the States take up when they got there? Were they all agricultural, or did they actually go into industry or any particular profession or anything like that?
Well, because the period of the emigration was so long, if we say that the majority of it was between about 1860 and about 1920, when people first went over there, and when you had the Homestead Act, for example, that allowed them to have the land, the people who left were really farmers. They would work also on logging, and they would do heavy manual labor. But with the growing up of the next generation who got good education, very rapidly, Swedes became highly educated and were able then to take up new positions and new posts in new industries. So as I gave a sort of little hint, by around 1900, one of the deputy mayors of Chicago, who was himself an emigrant from Sweden, was able to take up that position because he'd had the start he needed. So I think what they did, they started on the land, they've quite rapidly moved towards the cities, and then became very successful people in a whole variety of different things, from sales to manufacture to the professions, as you imply, as well. And America, while not absolutely open to everybody, it's not quite as milk and honey as we might have thought. It was at least possible for people who worked hard to do well there. There were, of course, we remember, don't we, that other national groups, let's say from the Far East and from Ireland, perhaps, were subject to rather more prejudice and were not quite so lucky in their transition. But that didn't seem to affect the Swedes to any marked degree, as far as I can see. Oh, and another question's popped up. I hope that's all right, Julian. But another question's popped up, and I don't know the answer to it. I'll be quite honest. It's from A. Barkley about whether how many of the Swedes who went across were the Sami. That's a fascinating question. I'll have to take that away and try and find out. I did not know that, because I've rather been talking about people who in the south or the middle of Sweden who were on the land there. It's a fascinating idea that the Sami also went across.
If Neil Kent is with us, Professor Neil Kent, he's written
yes,
the Sami people, he might know, but he might not.
You're muted, Neil, unfortunately. Can you just unmute yourself?
Yep. No, I muted myself. So we've got Neil.
Okay, can you everyone hear me now?
Yep.
Yes, okay. Well, I'll use this occasion to be a sort of wicked fairy coming to the wedding with various objections about different things. First of all, I would say not many Sami at all went to America. First of all, because the problems in Sapmi, as it were, the areas of Sweden and so forth where the Sami lived were completely different than they were in the south. The Sami didn't live from agriculture. They lived, as everyone knows, from a large number from reindeer herding in the north. And the main problem in Sweden in the 1840s and 50s with the famine was not only a problem in Sweden, it was a problem in Scotland, it was a problem in Finland. I mean, it was far worse in Finland, where immense percentage of the population died because there simply was no food. And the ideals at the time, and also transport was extremely difficult. So rather like in Ireland, it was very difficult to get the food to the people who needed it. And also there was the idea that if you did give people the food they needed, it would encourage pauperism and people not working. That was an issue with that. Also, I remember seeing if I can go to, and the Sami peoples, when they went places, they tended to go to the capital cities, but in very small numbers. And there weren't that many Sami anyway. They tended to say, and they weren't encouraged to go anywhere else because there were state policies which almost, one could say, coerced the Sami into carrying on their reindeer herding, even if it left them impoverished. The second thing I remember, in the very beginning, there was a talk about people leaving because I think I saw a sign of cholera. Am I right in that?
Yeah, I think that's
yeah. And cholera was a strange disease. It was quite the opposite. People didn't move with cholera. Cholera only arrived in Europe in the 1820s by sea ship and railway lines, because before that it killed so many people quickly that they never had a chance to reach anywhere else. And once cholera came into place, people, because they didn't understand that it was carried by water, imposed quarantines. So when there was, and cholera largely affected cities. So when there were cholera epidemics, you weren't permitted to immigrate or go anywhere, and you either survived or you died. It wasn't like typhoid or those other diseases.
Mm.
Moving on from that, in the 20th century, I don't think it was the case that social democracy succeeded because it was better than conservatism. I mean, a lot of people might have thought it was, and some people thought it wasn't. But what was a great impetus in bringing it about was the Great War, because in the Great War, unlike the Second World War, where Sweden made a fortune through selling both to the Germans and to the Allies, in the First World War, Sweden suffered a huge economic series of problems, and nobody quite knew how to deal with it. And with all the strikes and disgruntlement, and seeing what went on in St. Petersburg, that gave a lot of impetus to the Social Democrats. And one other thing I'd like to mention in terms of pioneers that nobody's mentioned tonight is Sweden's slave colony in the Caribbean, St. Bartholomew's, which had slavery 15 years longer than the British colonies. Swedish African slavery was abolished between, depending on how you look at it, 1848 and 1850. And of course, there were Swedes who had settled in St. Bartholomew's and were active there. And finally, I'd like to mention, giving a plug, if anyone is interested in these various subjects that I've talked about, I've written 2 books on the subject. One, The Cambridge Concise History of Sweden, and the other, A Social and Cultural History of the Nordic Countries, which discusses the effects of epidemics and slavery and immigration and so on. And now I'll shut up and thank you both for a fascinating talk.
Oh,
Thank you, Neil.
thank you, Neil. That was really interesting. I mean, the
question, David.
The empire bit, which you're referring to there, in terms of St. Bartholomew's, etc., is a really interesting bit of Swedish history, and it would actually be a very interesting talk.
Love to do it.
Yeah, I think you should, Neil. I think we should definitely.
Fine. If I'm invited, I will.
Consider yourself invited.
Thank you. Just have to fix the date. And I've got some interesting slides relating to the Nordic slave colonies, because people don't realize 1.5% of all African slaves transported across the Atlantic were transported on Danish ships.
Really?
Yeah. Denmark was the second largest transporter of slaves. And again, Denmark, which had a lot more colonies in the Caribbean than Sweden, only abolished slavery around 1849 for the simple reason, in both countries, it was abolished against the will of the government. But the local governor of the Danish Caribbean colonies, St. Croix, and the capital Charlotte Amalia, there, which is now part of the American Virgin Islands, he was having a relationship with a slave, and she got on to him about it. And so in order to declare her free, and to make her happy, he, against the will of the government, declared slavery abolished in the Danish colonies.
Yeah, I think we're definitely going to get you to talk about that.
Anyway, thank you both again. It was so interesting.
Thank you. Good. Thank you.
And I also learned lots of new things myself in it. So I shall mute myself again.
Okay, well, so who else has a question? I'm flicking between 2 big screens here. Oh yes, I see Sam Osmond. You have to unmute. Unmute. No, you have to unmute. No. If you can hear us, Sam, please press the, yeah. Okay.
Yes, I've got you now. Thank you for your talk. You explained the whole thing in terms of how awful life was in Sweden in the 19th century. But were there any pull factors? Were there, for example, special societies set up in Minnesota to encourage immigration? Were the shipping companies trying to encourage immigration?
Absolutely, a great question. And the pull factors were particularly important once people had got seeded, shall we say, Minnesota and that part of the world. So yes, fares became much cheaper in the 1860s. There was a lot of encouragement for people to come across. There was some degree of subsidization. There was that Homestead Act I talked about, where people were given land just for setting up a homestead in America, and particularly to the west. And of course, there was the tales that came back, selective tales, though they may have been, about how wonderful it was. So there were quite a few pull factors, as well as the sort of continual pushes. But the pushes diminished over time as Sweden sorted itself out. And the other bit I haven't referred to is that America stopped being quite so welcoming in the 20th century to immigrants. Bit by bit, it started to close its borders for a whole variety of reasons. But for a while, there was a lot of pull as much as there was a lot of push. That's a good point you've made.
Thank you.
And let's see if anyone else is waving their hands. We're getting close to the end, or a little past the scheduled end. We're enjoying ourselves. Yes, we've got Tony Roberts, or possibly Eva.
Talks. On the latest about immigration, there were booking offices. There was one in a small town in Östergötland, which is now made into an immigration museum. There's a bigger immigration museum in Växjö. To comment to David Goldsmith, who I understand his view on Hull, well, I would still recommend a trip there when it is allowed to travel, and make contact with Dr. Nick Evans. He can show around and show where the immigrants stayed when they had gone off the boat and were waiting for the train. The house is still there. There is a platform from which the trains left for Liverpool, and he can show you that. And there is this statue that is more than the pointing with the family standing, looking to the country in the west. It's only that the direction is not perfect. It's he will have comments on that also. So there is a lot to see in Hull about the immigrants traveling through that city. And the city is also very proud of the migration. When they had their anniversary, that was 2017, I think, they had a lot of shows on that. There was on the Deep, which is a museum, where you could see the movement of different groups of people through the centuries.
That's a really fascinating. It's a very fascinating story. Thank you very much for that. I'd certainly like to go. Where was it again that I was supposed to go? Was it Växjö?
Well, the last is Hull.
Oh, Hull itself, yes.
Hull itself.
Yes.
Nick Evans.
Yes.
Is a person to contact.
So I apologize. I was a little flippant about Hull. I have actually been to Hull, and I'm fated to go back there, I think, in April, if travel is then allowed for business purposes. So what I'll try and do is spend a little time looking for that. And thank you for the hint. I really will, actually. And if I do, I'll tell you. Okay.
Just to follow up briefly, one of the highlights there was the premises that they had created to quarantine the immigrants on their way from Sweden across to America. They found subsequently that actually it was the immigrants who needed to be protected from the citizens of Hull.
Now, you may well think that, but I couldn't possibly comment, but it's a great story. Thank you.
Sorry, can I also just say, relating to Hull, somebody mentioned it, but I didn't hear. Hull is the home of William Wilberforce, who achieved the abolition of slavery. And what's seeing his museum there?
Yeah, absolutely. It's had a tougher time subsequently, Hull. I think it's fair to say, having been there once. But I'm sure there are hidden gems. I shall look for them harder next time I go.
I think it might just be time to reiterate our collective thanks to the speakers and to the attendees. And keep coming back, please. It's been wonderful to see all the faces, and look forward to seeing you next time. I'll leave the channel running a little bit, but that's enough from me. And anyone who wants to just linger and chat, by all means, unmute. Bye, everyone.
Bye, goodbye, and thank you.
Thank you very much for listening. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
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 Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Fascinating.